Hello, everyone. LC Holt here, and this is my update for the week of April the 20th.
We don't
Uh,
know when it is anymore.
who knows? Days days all sort of blend together. Joining me for this very special show, in which we're going to delve back into true crime, is our two of my best buddies, Ryan Rayonec and Rebecca Ivey, the double R's, as
I
I
was
like
going
to
to
call
say
them.
the R and R.
R&R are here with us. So thank you for joining me today, guys. We're going to be talking about a very famous case of celebrity true crime. We're going to be talking about Robert Blake, more specifically, the murder of Robert Blake's second wife, Bonnie Lee Bakley. It occurred May 4th, 2001. I remember very vividly when this happened. That it happened the
I
evening.
don't
You don't remember this?
at all.
Wow.
Because like, he wasn't in anything I ever watched growing up or cared
He was.
about. Like I barely knew at the time anyway. I barely knew who he was.
It was all over like late night comedy sketches and
What
Nancy
month?
Grace.
What month again was this?
Do what now?
What month again was this in 2001?
This was in May of 2001.
Yeah, so I guess if I didn't get into it like the trial as it was going on, then 9/11 happens and it's like he got lost in that old jumble.
Well, the reason I knew about Robert Blake is because growing up, we watched Beretta, which was the TV. That was the TV show that he had, in which he played a cop who was always getting into trouble, and he had a pet parakeet, and he had all these like
Yes.
he had these
What was it? You can't do the time, don't do the crime. That was
can't
one
do
of them.
can't do the crime, don't do the time, which is ironic in hindsight. And also, I knew him because my mother was of the generation that they grew up with the Little Rascals.
Yeah.
And Robert Blake, though he was Bobby Blake back then, was one of the Little Rascals back in the 1940s. But we'll get to that here momentarily. And also, I love, there's this David Lynch movie. I'm a huge David Lynch fan named Lost Highway. And it came out maybe 3-4 years before this occurred. So Robert Blake was in that movie as a very cool character called just simply Mystery Man. And again, it's kind of ironic, and I'll go into later why, considering what that character meant in that movie. So I was kind of familiar with him because of my connection to Lynch, because my mother liked the Little Rascals, and because I watched Beretta as a kid.
And he was in what was that? The Truman Capote in Cold Blood.
Oh, what he's most famous for, and we'll get into this on the
Sorry, I'm sorry.
Damn it, Rebecca! Stop rushing me. Okay.
Get to it.
All right, here we go. We're going to talk about. Let's talk about the events of May 4th of 2001. That evening, he and his wife, Robert and Bonnie Lee Bakley, went to Vitello's, which is an Italian restaurant in Studio City. Around just before 9:30 p.m., they paid the check. He paid with a credit card, Robert Blake did, and they walked a block and a half away from Vitello's down the street to where Robert Blake had parked his car, kind of in a darkened area next to a construction site which was fenced off. There was a large dumpster, the large industrial dumpsters like you see that the construction workers will throw massive amounts of trash into. He puts his wife in the car, or I should say she gets in the car. He gets into the car as well, rolls down the windows a part way, about halfway, even though it's a relatively cold night. And then he realizes, hey, wait, I left my gun back at the restaurant. Because,
That's what you do.
Put your gun on the table.
That's right. You just take your .38 revolver, you take it over to the restaurant with you, you put it down in a booth, and then when you get up to leave, you leave it in the booth, which, as someone who has had guns in the past, as someone who knows a lot of people who have been gun owners, probably the last thing they will generally do is forget where they put the gun.
Yeah, he should have had a bit like, I left my wallet.
Leaving his wallet is a lot less ironic considering how this turned out.
Yeah.
Because anyway, he leaves to go back and get his gun that he said left in the booth at Vitello's, even though nobody at Vitello's ever sees him coming back in to look for a gun or anything else in a crowded restaurant.
There was no camera?
there was no camera. This was 2001, so it's kind of pre the time when everybody had cameras everywhere. So there was no evidence like that. So he goes back to the restaurant. The next time anyone actually hears from Robert Blake is around 9:40, which is about 17 minutes later. He goes banging on the door of a house that's catty-cornered from where the car is parked. Gentleman opens the door, recognizes this guy as Robert Blake because maybe he watched the.
That'd be so awesome if I did watch Beretta.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Maybe he watched the Parakeet show too, like I did.
Like, where's the parakeet?
Hey, it's Beretta. And so, Tony Beretta's banging on his door. And Tony Beretta says, someone's hurt my wife. Please call an ambulance. Call an ambulance. He's frantic. And the guy calls an ambulance, or he calls 911 at 9:40 and says, a guy's banging at the door. He says his wife's beat up because that's what the fella tells. I guess maybe Robert Blake said something like that. She looks like she's beat up or something.
Yeah, he didn't mention shot.
No, he didn't mention shot. And so at that point, Robert Blake says, I'm going to go get help. And he runs back to Vitello's. And at that point, people do see him when he returns to Vitello's for what would have been the second time. And he goes in there and he yells for a doctor. And while he's doing that, the fellow who had called 911 goes out to the car that's parked and sees this woman lying across the front console, sort of draped over the driver's seat. She's in the passenger seat. And he picks her up, and he's got a towel because the 911 operator said, put something against her head, get a fresh towel, clean towel, put it on her head and stop the bleeding.
Apply pressure, which that's kind of funny.
Right. Well, I guess the guy was thinking.
Put a towel on it.
I guess the guy was giving advice for someone who was beat up. I don't know, because that's what the guy said was that the wife had been beat up. But it wasn't until this guy turned on the dome light and, the woman is in there moaning and gurgling that he sees she has a gunshot wound in her cheek. And then that's when he realizes this woman hadn't been beat up. This woman had been shot.
Can you imagine someone leading you in that position, though? If someone's like, if I told you, hey, Elsie, I messed up. I slapped my girlfriend. And then you're like, oh, okay, let me go talk to her. And she's shot in the head.
I mean, you were sitting there watching
pretty
Beretta.
Big distance between I lost my temper and.
Yeah, and she got shot. Well, and the guy said
Twice.
that Robert Blake came back to the car, but would not come near the car. He said he stayed in the road and was yelling, what happened to her? What happened to her? And the guy said, and also, by the way, he had found a nurse, an off-duty nurse Robert Blake had in Vitello's, and the nurse came to the scene, and then she was assisting. And then shortly thereafter, the actual ambulance arrived. And then Robert Blake's wife, Bonnie Lee Bakley, was still alive at this point. She was in the last throes of life, but she was still.
This was the only part he seemed genuine to me in the whole thing when he was like, hurry, he on the phone, you could hear him in the background, where it seemed like he actually wanted, the police there. But that was the only thing that made sense pretty much throughout the rest of it.
And
the rest of it doesn't make sense.
And that was the thing that one of the police detectives said, because the two of the cops ultimately were tasked with just keeping their eye on Robert Blake. And, he's the husband, he's in distress. One of the things the cops said is that even though Robert Blake was sobbing and so forth, he didn't seem to actually be producing tears. And another thing the cops said is when he was consoling Robert Blake, saying, she's still alive, she could make it. The detective said that Robert Blake seemed very concerned about the idea of her making it, which, it's one of those things where you don't know how people would react within a situation of severe trauma, but generally a loved one's dying and you hear, well, they're going to make it, you would be more reassured.
Yeah.
It seemed to me. Go ahead, Rebecca.
Oh, I was just also thinking, what they said about he was crying, but not producing tears. But then it also have to think, and I don't mean to sound mean about this, but I'm sure this goes through people's heads as well. He's an actor.
Exactly. Yes, he's a very good actor. He's done over 160 films and television shows.
But you know how people are today. He would never use his acting skills to get out of murder.
Exactly. Right. Well, and also, I guess we'll talk about this when we get a little further into it, but this was coming right on the heels of the O.J. Simpson trial. So, and ironically, if you look at it as a whole, and we'll go through the whole thing, by the end of this hour, there were a lot of similarities in how the trials turned out, and there were civil cases, and then how the civil cases turned out, and just in the media. Obviously, Robert Blake wasn't as big and blown up as O.J. Simpson. Robert Blake's murder did not spawn a whole television network the way O.J. Simpson's did. But perhaps if court TV hadn't been around and Robert Blake's wife was murdered first, maybe it would have sparked a big thing. And, there was this whole idea that both of these guys are kind of celebrities on the fringes. They had done their big thing and then sort of faded from view a little bit, and now suddenly, oh, wow, everybody cares about Robert Blake when they weren't really talking about him all that much in the past few years.
It's a weird way to get attention.
Now, but the one thing I should say about this with the O.J. Simpson trial in connection to it was with O.J., the criminal investigation was relatively short. And I think what happened with the Robert Blake case is that the police, the detectives, really wanted to make sure they had enough evidence to get this guy. So it actually was almost a year from the murder before Robert Blake was arrested and charged. That was in April of 2002. He was arrested and charged, along with a longtime friend and bodyguard of his, a guy named Earl Caldwell, who had a very mysterious list that they found of things like shovels, lye, acid, and they were like, "Why do you need this?" 22 ammo, I think, was one of the things on the list. Speaking of ammo, I should point out a huge part of this case.
Yeah, I love the 3 bullets missing.
Yes, it was. And
then to not match up, I'm sorry, I probably ruined the best part of the story, just jumping ahead of you, but like it was great when I heard that. I was like, no way. That was the best part of the whole story to me.
It was a no way moment because they found on the scene of the crime the murder weapon. It was a gun thrown in the dumpster. Remember the dumpster I was telling you about? Huge construction dumpster. Walther, which, by the way, James Bond's gun, not the same model, a Walther P38 was found, which is an old World War II German handgun. Very hard to trace. The serial number was scraped off of it, and it was covered in oil, which if you cover a gun in oil, you destroy the fingerprints. It was thrown into the dumpster. Now, this was, without a doubt, the murder weapon. It still had one bullet, a 9mm bullet in the chamber. What Ryan is referring to is that in Robert Blake's house, they found a 100 pack of 9mm bullets, and exactly 3 of those 9mm bullets were missing from the pack. So you had the 2 gunshot wounds to Bonnie Lee Bakley, and you had the one that was still in the chamber equals 3 bullets. Now, the one problem with that is that the bullets used to kill Bonnie Lee Bakley were factory bullets, whereas the 3 bullets missing from Robert Blake's pack of 100 were hand loaded bullets.
They had to think on the way to testing those, they had like the nail in the coffin.
Oh, yeah. I mean, what are the chances that this guy...
Exactly 3 bullets missing, exactly 3 bullets found, and then they're not the 3 bullets. You would have bet. I wish there would have been Vegas odds on that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that during like OJ and during Robert Blake, Vegas must have been going crazy with just absolute betting on all this shit. But anyway, before we get too far ahead, let me talk a little bit about the man, Robert Blake. Now that we've gone over basically the events of the night in sort of a nutshell. He was born September of 1933 to 2 parents in New Jersey, Elizabeth and James. Now, they had 3 children in total, his parents did. And they were sort of a song and dance act. They wanted to be celebrities. They wanted to be in the entertainment industry, and they wanted their children to be in the entertainment industry. Do what? Go ahead.
There's like 1,000 things I could have said there. I'm just leave that one alone.
Well, when trying to do this, they moved their family to Los Angeles, and that's where Robert Blake grew up. Now, Robert Blake's real name is Michael James Gubletosi. Okay, it's not Robert Blake. The name was changed by MGM once he got a job doing Our Gang, which became the Little Rascals. And this was in the 40s. Now, his father was, I think, very embittered and angry that his son perhaps got so much fame so early when this guy had been trying to get fame for a long time. Go ahead, Rebecca.
I was gonna say I read that he was like, they said he was an alcoholic, was abusive. They used to make him eat food off the floor.
According
in
to
a closet.
I mean, according to Robert, I love how you laugh at that.
I'm like, oh my God. I don't think it's funny. I'm just
the Robert Blake, yeah, that's what Robert Blake said. You know, he said that, as you said, they would lock him in the closet. He said one time his dad put a dog leash on him and walked him around the neighborhood on all fours because he was saying, "Well, you think you're a big shot, huh? You think you're making all this money? Well, that's what."
None of the neighbors were like,
he didn't.
Hey, that's
he didn't shoot this guy though.
No, he didn't shoot his father. No. Yeah, Rebecca was saying that's one of the Little Rascals. Hey, look at him. Look at, oh, isn't that cute?
Like, what did someone say? Well, of course, back then people didn't. It's like, oh, just let the parent deal with their kid.
Yeah. This is the 1940s, so they probably.
Well, how did his dad? I mean, his dad eventually committed suicide, correct?
Yes.
I mean, how did he commit suicide? Did they talk about it? Was it?
I'm not sure exactly how he committed suicide, but I know that
using 3 bullets that he found.
Was it a Walther P-38? No, Robert apparently did not kill his father.
I'm just kidding. I didn't think he did.
Even though he probably wanted to.
Yeah. And that's the person you probably should have.
Yes. Now, I should say that Robert Blake was a very successful young actor. He grew up with, he quite literally went to school with Elizabeth Taylor. They were the same age. There are pictures of the two of them at school together, on the set.
MGM school.
Yes, this was like not school. This was like, studio school. But nonetheless, they went there together. He did a very famous film where he played John Garfield as a little boy, and he quotes, still to this day, Robert Blake talks about what a great man John Garfield was, how influential he was in his life. He was famous in the mid-40s for playing Little Beaver in the Red Ryder serials, the Westerns, which I think he hated at the time and probably still hates to this day. I'm talking about Robert Blake. He was in The Treasure of Sierra Madre with Humphrey Bogart. He worked with a lot of people at a very young age. Around 1950, Robert was drafted into the military, and he served time in the Army. He returned. When he returned, though, he found that, he wasn't this cute little kid anymore. He was now a 20-something-year-old man. So it was hard for him to get back into fame. I think he experienced a little bit of that child star syndrome. But even though he got addicted to cocaine and he was using heroin, he was even selling
it.
Yes.
What the fuck?
He managed to get past these addictions and eventually, through much persistence, landed the role of Perry Smith in the much anticipated adaptation of Truman Capote's.
We gotta back up a second. Whatever came out that he had to admit out loud, I sell heroin?
Well, he wrote a book. He wrote an autobiography, and he's admitted.
You don't think maybe leave out the selling heroin part just a little, like?
Well, this is the thing about Robert Blake. He has this weird. Well, I think weird would be an understatement. Okay. I'm not trying to be cruel, and I know he's at 86, he's still alive and still kicking, and frankly, I don't want him showing up at my fucking door. But let me just say, he's a little eccentric, to say the least. And he kind of has this weird thing where he talks about, when he was in solitary confinement, he was like, I was thrown in a concrete box. He's always talking about, I don't want to play another cop on the boob tube. He talks like he's like a 1930s gangster, as if he's still sort of living within the John Garfield sort of era of gangster pictures. So maybe, I don't know, maybe he was kind of in a way proud that, I sold smack on the streets, sort of thing. I don't know. But I got over it. I hit the wall and I punched straight through it. I bulldogged my way through that, that sort of deal. But anyway, he wound up as Perry Smith in the adaptation of Truman Capote's novel, In Cold Blood. It is actually I can't remember exactly what they call it. It was a nonfiction novel. That's what it was, because it is based on a true crime that occurred in the Midwest. And these were all people that Truman Capote knew. He researched the actual crime. He knew Perry Smith. He wrote a book, which he called the nonfiction novel, which basically just means it was written like a novel, but it's all true. And then that book became a sensation, made Truman Capote's career. He sold the rights and was very particular about who was cast in this movie, how it was shot, who was going to direct it, because Truman Capote had written films and had some of his written works adapted, and he wasn't happy with it. But he wanted In Cold Blood to be something he could be proud of. And the movie turned out great, and it rejuvenated Robert Blake's career, because this was a hell of a performance, I must say, that he gave in Cold Blood. And nobody can say that Robert Blake is not a good actor.
Yeah.
Robert Blake is a very, very good actor. And that's probably why he's worked so many years in so many films and television. He did a lot of cowboy shows, Have Gun Will Travel, and
he turned down Bonanza.
He turned down the role that Michael Landon played in Bonanza. Yeah, he said, "This is not for me. This is the skits. This role hits the skits." But he did eventually go on, as I said, to play Tony Beretta for 4 years on the TV show Beretta.
And then TV movies, Beretta.
Yes, he also did a series of TV movies with a character called Joe Dancer, who was a private investigator, who was sort of like Beretta, but was
without the parrot.
No parrot, yeah, and he wasn't a cop; he was just a PI in that. He did a number of shows that he headlined. Most of them were not as successful as Beretta. I mean, there was a show he did called Helltown, where he played a priest on the mean streets, and banging heads where heads needed to be banged, sort of thing. But that got canceled real quickly. I like how I'm sort of falling into the Robert Blake persona. I promise you, I'm going to leave my handguns off screen.
You'll have to go and get them.
That's right. And
you forgot them at the table.
That's right. I left them over at Vitello's. I'll be back shortly. And then I just sort of disappear off screen. And you hear a gunshot. Oh, that was too far. But
remember his interview on Piers Morgan? You're asking for it.
Yeah. That was one hell of an interview.
I wish I would have watched that.
Oh, man, you got to check that out. And we'll get into that here. We'll get into that. Rebecca keeps trying to nudge me forward.
I didn't know you were going to talk about Piers Morgan. I didn't know.
I think something that's really ironic about the Robert Blake thing in terms of his career is that the last two films he appeared in were strange in terms of what the subject matter was. He appeared in a TV movie called Judgment Night, which was about a man named John List. He played John List. It's another true story. John List is a guy who murdered his wife and his whole family and tried to get away with it. And then, as I said, one of my favorite film roles of his was as the mystery man in Lost Highway, David Lynch's, I think, really great film. In that film, he is so completely eerie. He's in white, his face is white, his hair is slicked back, his eyebrows have been cut off, and he appears in these really mysterious scenes with Bill Pullman, who's the star of the movie, saying very ominous things. And what I have interpreted from this movie, because like I said, it's a David Lynch film, so it's up for interpretation. But what I have interpreted, Bill Pullman plays a man who murders his wife and then tries to psychically convince himself that someone else did it, that he didn't do it. And so what Robert Blake basically plays in that film.
Wow, that's really fucked up.
It's kind of eerie because Robert Blake plays the dark side of
It's
Bill
almost
Pullman.
like he says, I know what character to go into right now.
Exactly. It's almost like when he married this woman, he thought back to those last few movies he did and was like, I got an idea.
You use this character and everything.
But what you read about their whole courtship, though, is just you think, why did you marry her?
Well, let's talk for a minute about her in question, the victim.
Yeah.
This was the second marriage of Robert Blake's. He'd been married before. He had 2 children who were adults.
This was the part where I was like, it gets better.
And he had been married to his first wife for a while, and they'd been divorced for a long time, very long time.
Yes, he had also been in a committed relationship with a young woman between the first wife and Bonnie Lee Bakley, who he apparently was very in love with, who died very suddenly of a brain aneurysm, and was, I think, very kind of a crushing thing to Robert Blake, who is, I think, by all accounts, a very emotional man. I don't think you can argue that point.
Cry.
He's an emotional man who doesn't cry and who is extraordinarily defensive. And that goes back to the Piers Morgan interview, where he just ripped Piers Morgan to pieces over it. Anyway, we'll get to that. Bonnie Lee Bakley. She was quite a few years younger than Robert Blake. She was born in the 1950s, 1956 to be exact, also from New Jersey. She was raised by her grandmother. She dropped out of school when she was 16, wanted to be a model and an actress. She was going to pursue that sort of deal. At the age of 21, she married her first cousin, which is never a good sign.
No.
But surprisingly, marrying her first cousin was actually her second marriage. Before that, she had married a man who had immigration problems. And
yeah, she'd been married like 8 or 9 times?
She was married in total 10 times.
10 times.
Yes. The first man was a man who had come into the country and wanted to stay here legally, and so she agreed to marry him, but I think the marriage lasted about 2 days. Some of her marriages only lasted like a day or 2. She married a man who is famous. A man named Glenn Wolfe was one of the 10 husbands she had, and he is famous for holding the record for the most monogamous marriages one person has ever had in a lifetime, 29 marriages.
What?
But hey, if you're only married for
that's just filling out paperwork. Like, that's not marriage. That's just doodling like on paper.
That's what I mean. If you're only married to someone for like 3 days, it's easy to be monogamous. You know, I think it would be a lot harder to be monogamous for 29 years as opposed to having 29 wives. But anyway, Glenn thinks this is
like a complete.
It's a complete non-issue. Glenn thinks it's amazing, I guess. He's in the Guinness Book of World Records.
He's like, I got achievements, you see?
Glenn? I think Glenn Wolfe is still alive. I think he is, yeah. I could be wrong about that. But I do know one of the 29 was Bonnie Lee Bakley. Now, I think their marriage only lasted a couple days, too. But, hey, you know, Glenn's got a record to keep up. He may be married 35 times by the time he croaks. Now, Bonnie Lee, she had been arrested several times. Once in Little Rock, Arkansas, she was arrested for possessing 5 driver's licenses, count them, 5, and 7 Social Security cards.
People do the damnedest things.
Happens to me all the time. Right? they
How did they get here?
Hey, look at this. Well, you know what she needed a lot of those for? Is she had mailboxes. She would have a different name and a different driver's license.
She was catfishing people before there was catfish.
That's right. Long before the internet came about, Bonnie Lee Bakley was out there getting as many post office boxes as she could, because what she would do is she would put ads in these pornographic magazines, these Lonely Hearts sort of ads saying, hey, I'll send you pictures. I'll come love you long time. All you have to do is send me money. And a lot of people did. A lot of dudes did.
Gangster hustle.
See, now I don't understand why he just didn't have a story straight. Like, oh, she had this seedy background. Somebody like that may have killed him. I went back to the restaurant looking for my wallet.
No,
come up with something good.
He did say that.
Yeah.
That it was her background.
Going back to get a gun.
No, I mean, he was
say
like
that.
He probably did. He probably didn't say it in those words. He was probably like, had to go back to get my iron. I left my piece. You know, that's more.
That's don't say that. No.
I left my blackjack in the booth.
Even if it's true, don't say. Just like I forgot something at the restaurant.
It is the greatest alibi I've ever heard. It couldn't have been me. I was busy getting my gun.
That's
Or
why
say I had
You gotta remember, a lot of this is new to me, so I'm taking it for the first time. Like, what?
Or saying after eating all that rich food, I had explosive diarrhea. I always tell people explosive diarrhea. That's the excuse. No questions will be asked. People are like, oh, okay, yeah, okay.
Yeah, explosive diarrhea is the best alibi ever. But the most epic alibi ever is I left my piece in the booth.
I left my piece in the booth.
I had to go back for my iron, and my woman got shot. You know, that sort of deal. My dame got shot. You know. Now
yeah, I mean, she sounded shady, but I was just...
Well, she did. She was not nowhere near a perfect woman. She eventually, I guess, when she couldn't make a career as a model or an actress, she decided she was going to be famous by association.
We're leaving out the supposed death threats, though. You know, because they went through a whole bunch of them.
Yeah, I'm getting there. I just want to point out a couple of the people that she had kind of pulled scams on, and I mean celebrities. One in particular was Jerry Lee Lewis. She had been in a relationship with crazy old Jerry Lee. You know,
she's like, well, he married his cousin. Let's see.
Yeah, just like me, she says.
Yeah.
She married her cousin too. So they had something in common. She met up with Jerry Lee Lewis, and she had a sexual relationship with him and got pregnant with a daughter who she named after Jerry Lee. Well, Jerry Lee was like, I want a paternity test, Bonnie, because you're with a lot of men. Like, you're traveling all over the country meeting all these men. Because, by the way, when she was willing to go meet these men to get money out of them, she would drop them, she would dump them, but she'd get the money, but she would go and meet them. Now, the daughter, there was a paternity test on the daughter.
She get a flat tire while she was there. I'm paying for that too.
Yeah. Well, like I said, Jerry Lee wanted the DNA test, got the DNA test, wasn't his daughter. So Jerry Lee Lewis dodged a bullet, no pun intended. But he was not the last celebrity. She went after Dean Martin when she moved to Los Angeles. She went after Frankie Valli. She apparently had some sort of a delusion that she and Frankie Valli had dated when she was a teenager, which he says was not true. So she was trying to rekindle a romance with him that had never existed to begin with. Gary Busey, crazy ass Gary Busey. She tried to get.
Why?
Well,
is she meeting all these guys from her ads?
No. The guys from the ads.
This is the most effective pre-internet marketing of all time.
Yeah. No, Dean Martin wasn't in the Lonely Hearts ads. The ads guys, they were giving her money like to fix her car, to pay her rent and stuff. But she wanted like she was playing long game. And she wanted to hitch her wagon to a celebrity. So she was actively going after these celebrities, trying to find
like active celebrities, well-retired celebrities.
Yes. I guess, the idea of celebrities who had money, you know, as long as they had a bankroll, because she would check them out. And by check them out, I mean do their financials. She knew how much, she knew to the cent how much Dean Martin was worth, or Gary Busey or whoever. And then she would sort of find out where they hung out, where they like to eat. She would make herself sort of, doll herself up, I guess, and make an appearance. And, oh, look, it just happens to be Dean Martin. A lot of these people were smart enough to just say.
Leave all women.
Well, a lot of these people were just kind of smart enough to say, no, thanks, lady, but, or that maybe they bought her a drink or something. Two people who were not smart enough to avoid her were, number one, a fellow named Christian Brando. Christian Brando was the son of Marlon Brando, and he had been sent.
How was Scorsese not made her life into a movie?
Do what now?
How was Scorsese not done something with this chick's life? This is incredible.
Well, it is amazing that at least we haven't gotten a TV movie out of her life, because I could see Lifetime jumping all over this with no one else. And maybe they did, but I don't recall that ever happening. But Christian Brando was son of Marlon Brando. He'd been sent to prison because he murdered his sister's boyfriend, his sister Cheyenne, Marlon Brando's daughter. Cheyenne had apparently been smacked around by her boyfriend. Christian, who was well known for his volatile temper and his love for guns, went into the room where her boyfriend was sitting, which happened to be Marlon Brando's living room, and shot her boyfriend in the head point blank. He said there was a struggle. Apparently there wasn't a struggle, because you could tell by the way the guy was sitting there with the remote still in his hand that he was watching TV, and somebody walked up behind him and shot him. So Christian Brando murdered this fellow, was sent to prison for, I believe it was some sort of a manslaughter charge. It was not a major, he was serving like 10 years. So it was not like he had a life sentence. Now, Christian Brando, while in prison, was beginning to receive sexually explicit letters from Bonnie Lee Bakley. So they developed a pen pal relationship. She was pursuing him while he was still in jail. And when he got out of jail, she was there to greet him. And they began a sexual relationship in person, not just over the pens.
This woman's over the top. Like, wow.
She was there to greet Christian when he walked out of those gates, man. And they hooked up. At the same time this was going down, she had met Robert Blake at a jazz club. And again, ran the financials on him. Robert Blake had a great pension from the many, many 160-something movies he'd been in. He also had a lot of real estate investments. He was a millionaire. He was a multi-millionaire. Because he didn't just have the acting. He actually had branched out and made a really good deals in, like, he owned office complexes and things. So he was set. But so was Christian, because Christian had Marlon money, his father. Mm-hmm. So she kind of had two that she could choose from. And she was two-timing them both at the same time. So much so that when she got pregnant, she didn't know who the father was. So Colin Maury Povich, right? Long before. But here's the deal. She told first it was Christian. She told Christian it was his child, this little girl that was born. She named her daughter Christian Brando. So she named him after Christian. She was pretty sure it was his. But she was also telling Robert Blake, well, I don't know for absolute certain. So Robert Blake said, okay, dame. Okay, honey, you're going to have to go and get a DNA test. So he's pulling a Jerry Lee Lewis, right? Gets the DNA test. Come to find out, the child is Robert Blake's. So Christian Brando, Bonnie Lee Bakley had a habit of tape recording phone conversations. And she had tape recorded a phone conversation with Christian Brando, in which Christian Brando is on record on this phone conversation saying, you're very lucky someone hasn't put a bullet in your head. So we have to keep in mind, Christian is volatile. Christian likes guns.
He's already been in jail once.
We know for a fact that he likes to shoot people in heads.
While watching the TV.
Yeah. So, and while they're sitting unsuspecting.
Yes.
As Bonnie Lee was in a car and as Dag was in the Marlon Brando's living room. So let's just keep that on the table as we continue talking about this. Because, as I said, a lot of two-timing going on between these two fellas. Robert Blake found out that the baby was his, promptly said, change the name. My daughter is not going to be named after Christian Brando.
How old was the kid at this point?
The kid's just a baby. I mean, just born. An infant. And so the name was changed to Rosie. Rose Lenore Blake. And I tell you, man, I feel for Rose Lenore, because what happens next is pretty intense.
I saw an interview with her with People Magazine. I think it was from last year, because they said she was 19 at the time.
Yes. Yeah.
It was very, yeah.
She's come out lately.
Yeah.
And a lot of what she's talking about is the fact that, she never knew her mother. Robert Blake obviously did. Robert married Bonnie Lee Bakley because he said, well, look, we have a child together. I'm going to do the right thing, and I'm going to marry you. According to him, it was the right thing. They got married in November of 2000. Keep in mind, when the murder happened was about 4 months later, so they were not married very long.
I don't think, that's why I don't understand why he married her. I think he would have had a good case of getting custody.
Oh, absolutely. She had nothing except for the scam artist business. And she was still running these scams, these mail order scams.
And
This
that's
was
another.
going, yeah, this was going on while she was living in the guest house behind Robert's place.
So
She
so
should
you,
have
you
dated
kind
Frank
of think.
Abagnale.
So you start to think, well, could it have been Christian, or was she scamming someone else who got pissed off?
Well, that's something Robert Blake has mentioned several times, is there were a lot of people who might have been pissed off by Bonnie. The cops never found any letters threatening her or anything, but she could have destroyed the letters. That doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
She might have only kept positive letters. Who knows? I don't know.
Yeah.
I do know that she was continuing this scam while she was living with Robert Blake. They did not live in the house together. They lived on the same property because Robert Blake had a 3-bedroom home in the San Fernando Valley, and he had a little guest house out back, and Bonnie lived in the guest house with the baby. So they were not living during the 4 months they were married as like a traditional married couple. She was also continuing her business out of that guest house. So it's not like she got married, settled down with the kid, and just said, okay, I'm not going to do this mail order, lonely heart thing anymore. Still doing it. And so anyway, Blake hired a private investigator to find out more about Bonnie after the fact. So by the time she was murdered, he was well aware of her background in kind of total, and then the murder happened.
Why would you even want to be anywhere near that when you've got legitimate money?
Oh,
and he could have hired a good lawyer and gotten that kid. And
absolutely.
He didn't have to marry her and put her in a guest house.
No, yeah, absolutely. There's no real reason for any of that. But here's what came out later in the trials and in the investigations, in the criminal trials, was there were a couple of guys, okay, former stuntmen, one named Hamilton and the other one named McClarty, both deceased now, who said that Robert Blake had contacted them in the months after the marriage saying that he wanted to hire someone to kill his wife. And Hamilton told them, we can't talk about this over the telephone. This was back in the days when you still had public telephones. So Hamilton said, we're going to buy you a phone card. This was alleged. This is what Hamilton said. He said, I had Robert Blake buy a phone card, and I said, go to a payphone and only call me with this phone card, and they won't be able to trace it. Well, the problem is Robert Blake missed the whole public telephone part, and he used it from his home phone. And even though you're using a prepaid phone card, if you're
I'll just use a different voice.
Right. In the East, the Far East, they bury a man to his neck in the sand. That's from Lost Highway. He tells that story to Bill Pullman. He's like, in the East, the Far East, they bury a man to his head in the sand and let the birds gouge his eyes out. That's what he was saying to Hamilton, on the telephone, I guess, on the prepaid call. But the thing about the prepaid thing is you can trace it. And they,
well, yeah, it's from your phone.
Yeah, and they did. The cops were so bright that they managed to trace it. And guess who Robert Blake called with those phone cards? And only with those phone calls were two men, Hamilton and McClarty, the two men who later came independently and said he was trying to hire them to kill his wife. So absolutely, positively, Robert Blake used that phone card to only call those two people. Maybe kind of coincidental that those are the two people who said, this guy's trying to get me to kill his wife. What do you think?
And you went back to get your gun.
And you went back to get your gun. And it was left at the scene. And let me just throw this out there. Okay, let's put ourselves in the mindset of this night, May 4th, 2001. Okay, let's say I'm a hitman, and I got hired to go murder this woman. And I have this rare World War II era Walther, which is practically untraceable because a lot of guns from that era during the war, there's no real way of tracing it back, especially with the serial numbers scraped off. So I have this untraceable gun. I go and I pop this woman a couple times in the crown with this. I'm starting to sound like Robert Blake again. I shoot this woman a couple of times in the head. And then what do? I take my untraceable gun and I can just leave. Right? I mean, I'm a hitman. There's no reason for me to leave this gun.
No.
Well, what does the hitman do? The hitman throws the gun, which, yes, he covered in oil, but there could still be a fiber on there. There could be a fingerprint that he missed. There could be a thumbprint on the bullet that's still left in the throat, in the chamber. And he just throws that into a dumpster when you could completely, you could take the gun with you and no one would ever find it. So why would the gun be in the dumpster? To me, it seems like the gun would be in the dumpster because the man who did it doesn't want to be found with it. Yes, doesn't want to be found with it. And Robert has to be the one to find his wife. She's sitting in his car dead. He can't just stay in the restaurant all night. Eventually he's got to come back and find her and be the guy that does it. Now listen, that's just the scenario. That's only in my opinion. I'm saying this for legal purposes. This is just what I was going through my mind. Okay. If I were a hitman, I'd take the gun. You'd never find it.
Yeah. Because you could dump it somewhere else.
You could dump it in the river.
Yeah.
Why would you ever want the cops to find that gun?
Yeah.
Whether it's covered in oil or not.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Kaylee Anthony or Kate. Which one was the mother? The mother, Casey?
Casey Anthony, wasn't that the child?
I get them confused. Which one was the mom? Which one was the kid? Either way, she's like, yeah, let's just bury the kid like right by the house, like. Right.
Yes. Again, it does not scream of something that's like a professional hit job. People who aren't very good make these sort of mistakes. And you could say, well, why didn't they test Robert Blake's hands for gunpowder residue? Of course they did. And there was gunpowder residue on his hands. There just wasn't enough, they said, to justify saying it came off of that weapon being fired. But, he was sitting on the ground. He was rubbing his hands in the wet grass. He was touching his head. He was washing his hands at the police station when he went to the bathroom twice. All this was going on before they did the gunpowder residue test. So naturally, there wouldn't be as much. So listen, this sounds like I'm trying to say Robert Blake absolutely positively did this. Obviously, I don't know. I wasn't there. I'm just saying these are some oddities in the case that I think are worth pointing out. So anyway, what do you guys think?
I think at a minimum, worse people could be murdered.
Yeah.
Like, if he's gonna even potentially be guilty, she probably deserved to get shot in the head twice, allegedly.
Okay, let me unpack this.
So you can edit
she's a lifetime hustler con artist. Like, I don't feel bad. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay.
You know what I mean? Like that's why I feel. It's
saying.
Like, and then when you point out the legal stuff, it's like, oh, I'm just like, fuck what I think, but I'm just gonna sit over here with you guys.
Yeah, I'm giving
them the old, whatever.
Yeah, I totally get.
I'm not gonna pass you in the street and treat you like OJ. Like, how dare you?
Well, theoretically, you could pass Robert Blake in the street because the way this criminal trial came out, he was acquitted. These stuntmen who testified against him, the stuntmen had long histories of drugs. They had offenses. They had gun offenses in their past. Apparently, some of their stories didn't line up. So, in spite of all this evidence, and there was a fair amount of circumstantial evidence in the case.
Kind of explains the sloppy, though. It was almost like, look, I really, really don't want to do this, but you do not understand how dead I need this chick. So if I can't get these guys to do it, I'm gonna do it. And it ended up being, if that's the case, I'm just saying if that was the case, then these guys really, in a weird way, ended up helping him, because then all this stuff is just lawyer fodder. They're just throwing this at the jurors. Like, here you go. These guys are no good. Acquit him.
Yeah, you make a good point, because, yeah, I mean, I think that that's kind of going down the street that I personally believe is that maybe Robert Blake just decided, well, if I can't get these guys to kill her for me, well, maybe I can do it.
What was that Ryan Gosling movie where he was with the guy from my names are escaping me, Silence of the Lambs, and they did that legal movie?
Fracture.
And Fracture. It was really good. And he's like, he's basically making the point, like, I've got you by the balls. And this guy's like, you don't even know what game you're playing.
Right.
with the whole, the two guys, it's like, we got him now. We're going to get these two guys, and that's just going to be the death of him. And he's going to be like, I set this up so you would
Right. Yeah. Oh, man. I should say that the acquittal that happened in 2005, March of 2005. So a lot of time is passing between the murder in 2001 and the eventual acquittal in 2005. Now, Robert Blake, there wasn't a long period of time, however, between the criminal trial ending and the civil trial beginning, because Bakley's children, because she had 4 children and counting Rosie, her 3 other children sued Robert Blake for wrongful death. And there was this civil trial, which, again, I was saying similarities with O.J. Simpson. Exact same thing happened there, where he got off on the criminal charges. And in the civil trial, like O.J., Robert Blake was found liable for the murder of Bonnie Lee Bakley and was ordered to pay the Bakley children $30 million. Now, Robert Blake has said that the reason he lost the civil trial is because he was suicidal and he was losing his mind. And one of the reasons he said he was, and without getting into too many details of like children's, parental things, Blake had an adult daughter. And while he was in prison in solitary confinement, while he was in his cement box, serving his Jones, the daughter adopted Rosie, and the daughter's husband became the adopted father. So Robert Blake lost custody of his daughter to his own child and her husband.
Yeah, she even grew up calling them mother and father.
Yes.
I believe, from what the article I read.
And she calls Robert. Yeah. Her father. So it's a little confusing, but basically Rosie's mother is her sister, is her half sister. Does that make sense?
It's so Jack Nicholson.
It is very Jack Nicholson. But unlike Jack Nicholson, I think she was actually told from an early age what the difference.
Yeah.
Jack Nicholson found out later that his mother was his aunt and his grandmother was his mother and all this crazy. But anyway, so that happened. He was found liable, $30 million. On appeal, it was eventually reduced to $15 million, but Blake was broke at this point. So between 30 and 15, it might as well be $1 billion because he didn't have it either way, because he lost everything. As Robert Blake has explained, in lieu of a will, he had decided early on to start giving away a lot of his property, his real estate investments, and so forth to his children, his adult children. So he was signing over stuff to them. And he wanted to do that before he died so there wouldn't be this big will wrangling thing, where everyone's fighting. It kind of bit him in the ass because after the trial and after the civil case, he didn't really have anything that he owned himself left other than the house. And then he had a lien on that from the government for back taxes. Mm-hmm. So he lost that.
And he now still owed the lawyers.
One of which was that Mazaru, I believe his name is, the Michael Jackson lawyer, the celebrity lawyer. And I'm sure he cost a pretty penny. So yeah, Robert Blake is in debt for the rest of his life. And being that he's 86 years old now, that probably is not going to be that much longer. Though it's amazing that he's lived this long with the life that he's had. As Rebecca said, in 2002, he made an appearance on Piers Morgan live on CNN, and I'll tell you what, that's one for the books.
I just remember when it came on.
It's worth watching just to see Robert Blake call Piers Morgan Charlie Potatoes. Listen here, Charlie Potatoes.
I gotta watch this.
You really do, because he's wearing like a 1920s bowler looking hat, like a cowboy bowler, and he's got like a vest on with no shirt underneath, like a leather sort of vest with like no shirt. He starts off with like a blazer, and then that blazer comes off at one point.
He's like, getting hot in here.
Yeah. And he's like, and you know, Robert Blake is he's really short guy, but he's one of those short guys that's like, you know, kind of solid. If you remember back in the Beretta days, he was just like made of muscle, you know, I mean, he was huge. And even as an older man, even now he's sort of getting to that point where he's withering. But like on the Piers Morgan, he's like showing off his saggy guns and shit, you know, with his little vest on and his crazy bowler hat. And he's screaming at this guy. And he's talking about, I mean, literally screaming at Piers Morgan and talking about, well, I don't know who you represent, but who you represent doesn't know me and all this, you know.
Mr. Potatoes.
Yeah, Charlie Potatoes, that man in your ear. That's what he said. Listen here, Charlie Potatoes. I know you got a man in your ear there, and I don't know who he represents. It's great. You would love it.
Someone could make a song out of this, because this came out during that time where like these YouTube kids weren't like remixing interviews and stuff and making tracks out of them. Like there was probably a great missed opportunity because it was an entirely different era.
Why don't we have a Robert Blake remix? This is a brilliant idea.
Why don't you guys email the YouTube page that does all that? Was it Shwee or whatever?
Yeah, I mean that actually is a great point. That's a huge missed opportunity. I think we need to get on it.
To be honest, there's probably like a plethora of them, but because our minds aren't entrenched like in that era, you know, when it happened, we're thinking like the modern day. But there's got to be like 1,000 news stories these kids have never heard, where they would just slaughter them online, slaughter them.
I mean, the Piers Morgan thing it's just so made for that, you know. But anyway, definitely check that out. He actually was going on the show to promote his autobiography, and Piers Morgan apparently asked him if he would also be willing to talk about the murder of his wife. Robert Blake agreed to do so, and then just went off the rails.
But then on air, he's like, how dare you ask me about that?
Yes, he goes totally off the rails when Bonnie comes up. He's like, why would I take her to dinner to kill her? I could just have someone kill her when she was off in Tibet somewhere.
He's like, you know how much that dinner cost me?
That's right. Do you think that dinner was meant to be her last meal?
The Last Supper.
That sounds like something dramatic.
Last Dance.
It does.
Tomorrow on ESPN.
And, well, speaking of that, that's one of those things that Robert Blake would probably say. He would say, okay, honey, I'm going to take you to your last meal, and then we're going to dance. And dance means, you know, gangsta talk. Now, in 2017, Robert Blake married a third time. This was a very short-lived marriage that not many people knows about. He's not married anymore. They got divorced the next year. But he married a woman
How
named.
old was she?
She's younger than he is, but she's an older lady. Yeah.
Well, I didn't think she was 90.
Well, no, I mean she's I don't know, probably in her 60s.
Well, they get married in 2017. Is that right?
2017. Yeah, they got married.
Spring chicken.
Do what?
Spring chicken.
Well, she actually had known him for years, and she testified on his behalf at the trial. So this was a woman, I guess, that had stood by him, or at least he saw it as being that. But the marriage was probably a bad idea from the giddy-up because, like I said, it was over a year later. Her name was Pamela. And now he lives alone. He's been divorced since 2018. And he lives in a little apartment. And if you want to go over to Robert Blake's YouTube channel, you can do so even as we speak. He has an ongoing series running right now where he talks about his life. And he's talked about this kind of stuff that we're discussing here in great detail. For long periods of time, he sits and talks about what happened with not really the murder, but with, his child and how he lost custody of her and all that. he is definitely getting a little weaker. When you hear his voice on newer, like on those YouTube videos, it's not the same sort of, it's not the same voice that was screaming at Piers Morgan. He's definitely, showing his age of 86. And who knows how much longer he'll be around. In terms of, as we kind of wrap up the show, I want to just throw this at you guys, just to get your opinions, each one. In terms of Robert Blake's guilt, and none of us were there, none of us knows, but based on some of the evidence we've talked about here and other things that maybe you've seen in other places, what do you think? Do you think that Robert murdered his second wife, Bonnie Lee Bakley? Ryan?
It's probable. But, on the other end, you got to think, what if that one in whatever number chance was like you were just trying to leave somewhere with your girlfriend or wife or whatever, and legit come outside and she's shot in the head. Like the last thing anyone would want to go through is someone like, hey, it was you, and it's like, dude, I came out of I was eating and then headshot. Like that's a terrible position to be in. But the odds are, that he wasn't. Yeah, he did it. Yeah, probably.
Okay. Rebecca?
I don't know, because there was so much shady crap on her side. You don't know who she may have ticked off.
That's why I'm in gray area.
With
this is
her,
the biggest. I don't
with her
care.
whole scam thing and the whole, Christian brand. I'm like, dude, why did you marry her? Just get a lawyer, get the kid, get rid of her.
Mm-hmm. Yes. That would be the wise
and
thing.
And the whole I left my gun in the restaurant. I'm like, dude, don't. Just
most epic alibi ever.
Well, that and like you said, the gun. Who throws the gun? Like, right?
Yeah, that too. Yeah, and then the trace.
I think that the gun thing is the biggest one for me, because to me, if someone walks up and they murder you, the chances of them leaving the gun on the scene when they don't have to, very, very slim. This is just my personal opinion. I think
you would think someone would at least think it out. Hey, I'm about to shoot someone in the head. What should I do with this after? Maybe just like a quick 5-minute walkthrough before I go murder somebody. Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
You would think like if you're going to do something like this at all, it would be more thought out, which
yeah, I see what you mean.
It just seems too lucky to be like one of the 300 people she just had. And then you got to remember too, we're talking pre-internet. It's not as easy to find the girl who ripped you off in the magazine. Okay, say now, I mean, if we're smart enough, I can go be in Oprah's backyard in 4 hours, with a plane. If you've got enough access to the internet, you know how to use it, you can find anybody. We live in a different age, for the most part. But back then, I find it very hard to believe people are just finding her at random restaurants at random times, without GPS, without any signals, without any of this stuff we have now. I highly doubt it.
Right. Yeah. I think you make a great point. I think if people go to the Christian Brando thing, which other people, Masaru, one of Blake's attorneys, pointed out the Christian Brando connection. We'll never know. Christian Brando died of pneumonia 12 years ago. So if he had anything to do with it, his alibi was solid. He was in Washington State the night it happened. They absolutely confirmed that. So I don't see him being outside Vitello's and also being in Washington State. Anyway, these are the facts of the Robert Blake case as seen through the prism of this show. Obviously, I've made certain remarks where I have my doubts about Robert Blake's innocence. I wasn't there. I don't know who did it. I know that there's enough circumstantial shit with the gun. I keep going back to that. That's a big one for me. I don't see a random person leaving the gun at the scene. If you can take it with you, you take it. If you can't take it with you, you leave it. To me, that's the clincher. But again, wasn't there, don't absolutely know. But I would say I'm leaning toward Robert Blake being guilty of this.
Yeah.
Now, I certainly hope Robert Blake doesn't. I hope he doesn't see this and come climbing in my window tonight and say, "Hey, you, hey, young punk, get out here," that sort of thing. But anyway, that's our show for today about Robert Blake. I want to thank Rebecca for joining me. I want to thank Ryan. Thank you for joining me, direct from Las Vegas. And I want to thank all. I want to thank all you guys.
Nothing going on.
I want to thank all you guys for joining us in this hour. And until next week, we'll have another topic going on, and we'll let you know what that is come this time, yes, next week. Until then, stay healthy, stay safe, and take care of yourself.